Welcome to the MasterMind Library. They call me Ferdinand, the bringer of balance, leader of many disciplines, and your host of the MasterMind Library, the home of the MasterMind Book Club. And I'm here with one of my co-hosts, Trigger, and we've got our live audience of Elijah, Sincere, and Huey. They're listening in. And today we have a very special book. This is our 7th book that we've read in the MasterMind Library. We are at episode 74. Thank everybody for tuning in. Thank y'all for all your comments, the loves and the shares and the subscribes. Thank you for all of that. And we are starting a new book, The NeverEnding Story. So this is a book that is it came out a long time ago, but it is an amazing story. And the children love it. And today we're going to read this story. Our 7th book is always going to be for the children. All right. So today, The NeverEnding Story. We're going to go ahead and dive right into the prologue. So let me make everything a little bit larger. Okay. Let's see. The NeverEnding Story. All right. Prologue. Here we go right here. Carl Conrad Coriander, Old Books. First time I had to read backwards like that. All right, so let me make this a little bit larger for everybody. We're going to get started. It's a little bit bigger. Okay, that should be good. Let's make sure. All right, that's good. This inscription could be seen on the glass door of a small shop, but naturally, this was only the way it looked if you were inside the dimly lit shop. Looking out at the street through the plate glass door. Outside, it was a gray, cold, rainy November morning. The rain ran down the glass and over the ornate letters. Through the glass, there was nothing to be seen but the rain splotched wall across the street. Suddenly, the door was opened so violently that a little cluster of brass bells tinkled wildly, taking quite some time to calm down. The cause of this hubbub was a fat little boy of 10 or 12. His wet, dark brown hair hung down over his face. His coat was soaked and dripping, and he was carrying a school satchel slung over his shoulder. He was rather pale and out of breath, but despite the hurry he had been in a moment before, he was standing in the open doorway as though rooted to the spot. Before him lay a long, narrow room, the back of which was lost in the half-light. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books of all shapes and sizes. Large folios were piled high on the floor, and the several tables lay heaps of smaller, leather-bound books, whose spines glittered with gold. The far end of the room was blocked off by a shoulder-high wall of books, behind which the light of a lamp could be seen. From time to time, a ring of smoke rose up in the lamplight, expanded and vanished in darkness. One was reminded of the smoke signals that Indians used for sending news from hilltop to hilltop. Apparently, someone was sitting there, and, sure enough, the little boy heard a cross voice from behind the wall of books. Do your wondering inside or outside, but shut the door. There's a draft. The boy obeyed and quietly shut the door. Then he approached the wall of books and looked cautiously around the corner. There, in a high, worn leather wing chair, sat a short, stout man in a rumpled black suit that looked frayed and somehow dusty. His paunch was held in by a vest with a flower design. He was bald except for outcroppings of white hair over his ears. His red face suggested a vicious bulldog. A gold-rimmed pince-nez was perched on his bulbous nose. He was smoking a curved pipe, which dangled from one corner of his mouth and pulled his whole cheek out of shape. On his lap he held a book, which he had evidently been reading, for in closing it had left the thick forefinger of his left hand between the leaves as a kind of bookmark. With his right hand, he now removed his spectacles and examined the fat little boy, who stood there dripping. After a while, the man narrowed his eyes, which made him look more vicious than ever, and muttered, "Goodness gracious." Then he opened his book and went on reading. The little boy didn't know quite what to do, so he just stood there, gaping. Finally, the man closed his book, as before, with his finger between the pages, and growled, "Listen, my boy, I can't abide children. I know it's the style nowadays to make a terrible fuss over you, but I don't go for it. I simply have no use for children. As far as I'm concerned, they're no good for anything but screaming, torturing people, breaking things, smearing books with jam, and tearing the pages. It never dawns on them that grown-ups may also have their troubles and cares. I'm only telling you this so you'll know where you're at. Anyway, I have no children's books, and I wouldn't sell you the other kind. So now we understand each other, I hope." Give it to me. After saying all this without taking his pipe out of his mouth, he opened his book again and went on reading. The boy nodded silently, then turned to go. But somehow he felt that he could take this last remark lying down. He turned around and said softly, "All children aren't like that." Slowly the man looked up and again removed his spectacles. "You still there? What must one do to be rid of you? And what was this terribly important thing you had to tell me?" It wasn't terribly important," said the boy. St- "It wasn't terribly important," said the boy, still more softly. Said the boy still more softly. "I only wanted to say that all children aren't the way you said." "Really?" The man raised his eyebrows in affected surprise. "Then you must be the big exception, I presume." The fat boy didn't know what to say. He only shrugged his shoulders a little and turned to go. Anyway, he heard the gruff voice behind him. "Where are your manners? If you had any, you'd have introduced yourself." "My name is Bastian," said the boy. "Bastian Balthasar Bucks." "That's a rather odd name," the man grumbled. "All those B's." "Oh, well, you can't help it. You didn't choose it. My name is Carl Conrad Coriander. That makes 3 C's." "Hmm," the man grumbled. Quite right." He puffed a few clouds. "Oh, well, our names don't really matter, as well as we'll never see each other again. But before you leave, there's just one thing I'd like you to know. What made you come bursting into my shop like that? It looked to me as if you were running away from something. Am I right?" Bastian nodded. Suddenly his face was a little paler than before and his eyes a little larger. "I suppose you made off with somebody's cash box," Mr. Coriander conjectured, "or knocked an old woman down, or whatever little scamps like you do any nowadays. Are the police after you, boy?" Bastian shook his head. "Speak up," said Mr. Coriander. "Whom were you running away from?" "The others." "What others?" "The children in my class." "Why?" "They won't leave me alone." "What do what do they do to you?" "They wait for me outside the schoolhouse." "And then what?" "Then they shout all sorts of things and push me around and laugh at me." "And you just put up with it?" Mr. Coriander looked at the boy for a while disapprovingly. Then he asked, "Why don't you just give them a punch on the nose?" Bastian gaped. "No, I wouldn't want to do that. And besides, I can't box." "How about wrestling?" Mr. Coriander asked. "Or running, swimming, football, gymnastics. Are you no good at any of them?" The boy shook his head. In other words, Mr. Coriander, you're a weakling. Bastian shrugged his shoulders. But you can still talk, said Mr. Coriander. Why don't you talk back at them when they make fun of you? I tried. Well, they threw me into a garbage can and tied the lid on. I yelled for 2 hours before somebody heard me. Mr. Coriander grumbled. And now you don't dare. Bastian nodded. In that case, Mr. Coriander concluded, you're a scaredy cat too. Bastian hung his head. And probably a hopeless grind. Best in the class. Teacher's pet. Is that right? No, said Bastian, still looking down. I was put back last year. Good Lord, cried Mr. Coriander. A failure all along the line. Bastian said nothing. He just stood there in his dripping coat. His arms hung limp at his side. What kind of things do they yell when they make fun of you? Mr. Coriander wanted to know. Oh, all kinds. For instance, namby-pamby sits on the pot. The pot cracks up, says namby-pandy. I guess it's 'cause I weigh a lot. Not very clever, said Mr. Coriander. What else? Bastian hesitated before listing. Screwball, nitwit, braggart, liar. Screwball? Why do they call you that? I talk to myself sometimes. What kind of things do you say? I think up stories. I invent names and words that don't exist, that kind of thing. And you say these things to yourself? Why? Well, nobody else will be interested. Mr. Coriander fell into a thoughtful silence. What do your parents say about this? Bastian didn't answer right away. After a while, he mumbled. Father doesn't say anything. He never says anything. It's all the same to him. And your mother? She's gone. Your parents are divorced? No, said Bastian. She's dead. At that moment, the telephone rang. With some difficulty, Mr. Coriander pulled himself out of his armchair and shuffled into a small room behind the shop. He picked up the receiver and indistinctly, Bastian heard him saying his name. After that, there was nothing to be heard but a low mumbling. Bastian stood there. He didn't quite know why he had said all he had and admitted so much. He hated being questioned like that. He broke into a sweat as it occurred to him that he was already late for school. He'd have to hurry. Oh, yes, he'd have to run. But he just stood there, unable to move. Something held him fast. He didn't know what. He could still hear the muffled voice from the back room. It was a long telephone conversation. It came to Bastian that he had been staring the whole time at the book that Mr. Coriander had been holding and that was now lying on the armchair. He couldn't take his eyes off it. It seemed to have a kind of magnetic power that attracted him irresistibly. He went over to the chair, slowly held out his hand and touched the book. In that moment, something inside him went click, as though a trap had shut. Bastian had a vague feeling that touching the book had started something irrevocable, which would now take its course. He picked up the book and examined it from all sides. It was bound in copper-colored silk that shimmered when he moved it about. Leafing through the pages, he saw the book was printed in 2 colors. There seemed to be no pictures, but there were large, beautiful capital letters at the beginning of the chapters. Examining the binding more closely, he discovered 2 snakes on it, one light and one dark. They were biting each other. They were biting each other's tail, so forming an oval. And inside the oval, in strangely intricate letters, he saw the title, The NeverEnding Story. Human passions have mysterious ways, in children as well as grown-ups. Those affected by them can't explain them, and those who haven't known them have no understanding of them at all. Some people risk their lives to conquer a mountain peak. No one, not even they themselves, can really explain why. Others ruin themselves trying to win the heart of a certain person who wants nothing to do with them. Still, others are destroyed by their devotion to the pleasures of the table. Some are so bent on winning a game of chance that they lose everything they own. And some sacrifice everything for a dream that can never come true. Some think their only hope of happiness lies in being somewhere else and spend their whole lives traveling from place to place. And some find no rest until they have become powerful. In short, there are as many different passions as there are people. Bastian Balthazar Bux's passion was books. If you have never spent whole afternoons with burning ears and rumpled hair, forgetting the world around you over a book, forgetting cold and hunger, if you have never read secretly under the bedclothes with a flashlight because your father or mother or some other well-meaning person has switched off the lamp on the plausible ground that it was time to sleep because you had to get up so early. If you have never wept bitter tears because a wonderful story has come to an end and you must take your leave of the characters with whom you have shared so many adventures, whom you have loved and admired, for whom you have hoped and feared, and without whose company life seems empty and meaningless. If such things have not been part of your own experience, you probably won't understand what Bastian did next. Staring at the title of the book, he turned hot and cold, cold and hot. Here was just what he had dreamed of, what he had longed for ever since the passion for books had taken hold of him. A story that never ended. The book of books. He had to have this book at any price. At any price? That was easily said, even if he had more to offer than the bit of pocket money he had on him. This cranky Mr. Coriander certainly had given him clearly to understand that he would never sell him a single book, and he certainly wouldn't give it away. The situation was hopeless, yet Bastian knew he couldn't leave without the book. It was clear to him that he had only come to the shop because of this book. It had called him in some mysterious ways, because it wanted to be his, because it had somehow always belonged to him. Bastian listened to the mumbling from the little back room. In a twinkling, before he knew it, he had the book under his coat and was hugging it with both arms. Without a sound, he backed up to the street door, keeping an anxious eye on the other door, the one leading to the back room. Cautiously, he turned the door handle to keep the brass bells from ringing. He opened the glass door just wide enough for him to slip through. He quietly closed the door behind him. Only then did he start running. The books, copybooks, pens, pencils in his satchel jiggled and rattled to the rhythm of his steps. He had a stitch in his side, but he kept on running. The rain ran down his face and into his collar. The wet cold passed through his coat, but Bastian didn't feel it. He felt hot all over, but not from running. His conscience, which hadn't let out a peep in the bookshop, had suddenly woken up. All the arguments that had seemed so convincing melted away like snowmen under the fiery breath of a dragon. He had stolen. He was a thief. What he had done was worse than common theft. That book was certainly the only one of its kind and impossible to replace. It was surely Mr. Coriander's greatest treasure. Stealing a violinist's precious violin or a king's crown wasn't at all the same as filching money from a cash drawer. As he ran, He hugged the book tight under his coat. Regardless of what this book might cost him, he couldn't bear to lose it. It was all he had left in the world, because naturally he couldn't go home anymore. He tried to imagine his father at work in the big room he had furnished as a laboratory. Around him lay dozens of plaster casts of human teeth, for his father was a dental technician. Bastian had never stopped to ask himself whether his father enjoyed his work. It occurred to him now for the first time, but now he would never be able to ask him. If he went home now, his father would come out of his lab in a white smock, possibly holding a plaster cast, and he would ask, "Home so soon?" "Yes," Bastian would answer. "No school today?" He saw his father's quiet, sad face, and he knew he couldn't possibly lie to him. Much less could he tell him the truth. No, the only thing left for him was to go away somewhere, far, far away. His father must never find out that his son was a thief. And maybe he wouldn't even notice that Bastian wasn't there anymore. Bastian found this thought almost comforting. He had stopped running. Walking slowly, he saw the schoolhouse at the end of the street. Without thinking, he was taking his usual route to school. He passed a few people here and there, yet the street seemed deserted. But to a schoolboy arriving very, very late, the world around the schoolhouse always seemed to have gone dead. At every step, he felt the fear rising within him. Under the best of circumstances, he was afraid of school. But he was afraid of school, the place of his daily defeats, afraid of his teachers, who gently appealed to his conscience or made him the butt of their rages, afraid of the other children who made fun of him and never missed a chance to show him how clumsy and defenseless he was. He had always thought of his school years as a prison term with no end in sight, a misery that would continue until he grew up, something he would just have to live through. But but when he now passed through the echoing corridors with their smell of floor wax and wet overcoats, when the lurking stillness suddenly stopped his ears like cotton, and when at last he reached the door of his classroom, which was painted the same old spinach color as the walls around it, he realized that this, too, was no place for him. He would have to go away. So he might as well go at once. But where to? Bastian had read stories about boys who ran away to sea and sailed out into the world to make their fortune. Some because pirates are heroes, others grew rich, and when they returned home years later, no one could guess who they were. But Bastian didn't feel up to that kind of thing. He couldn't conceive of anyone taking him on as a cabin boy. Besides, he had no idea how to reach a seaport with suitable ships for such an undertaking. So where could he go? Suddenly, he thought of the right place, the only place where, at least for the time being, no one would find him or even look for him. The attic of the school was large and dark. It smelled of dust and mothballs. Not a sound to be heard, except for the muffled drumming of the rain on the enormous tin roof. Great beams, blackened with age, rose at regular intervals from the plank floor, joined with other beams at head height, and lost themselves in the darkness. Here and there, spider webs as big as hammocks swayed gently in the air currents. A milky light fell from a skylight in the roof. The one living thing in this place were times. Hey, listen, take the blanket down and stop, and don't do that again. Sit up. Not a sound to be heard, except for the muffled drumming of the rain on the enormous tin roof. Great beams, blackened with age, rose at regular intervals from the plank floor, joined with other beams at head height, and lost themselves in the darkness. Here and there, spider webs as big as hammocks swayed gently in the air currents. A milky light fell from a skylight in the roof. The one living thing in this place where time seemed to stand still was a little mouse that came hobbling across the floor, leaving tiny footprints in the dust, and between them a fine line, a tail print. Suddenly it stopped and pricked up its ears, and then it vanished. Whoosh! Into a hole in the floor. The mouse had heard the sound of a key in a big lock. The attic door opened slowly with a loud squeak. For a moment, a long strip of light crossed the room. Bastian slipped in. Then, again with a squeak, the door closed. Bastian put the big key in the lock from inside and turned it. Then he pushed the bolt and heaved a sigh of relief. Now no one could possibly find him. No one would look for him here. The place was seldom used. He was pretty sure of that. And even if by chance someone had something to do in the attic today or tomorrow, he would simply find the door locked and the key would be gone. And even if they somehow got the door open, Bastian would have time to hide behind the junk that was stored here. Little by little, his eyes got used to the dim light. He knew the place. Some months before, he had helped the janitor to carry a laundry basket full of old copybooks up here. And then he had seen where the key to the attic door was kept, in a small cupboard next to the topmost flight of stairs. He hadn't thought of it since, but today he had remembered. Bastian began to shiver. His coat was soaked through, and it was cold in the attic. The first thing to do was find a place where he could make himself more or less comfortable, because he took it for granted that he'd have to stay here a long time. How long? The question didn't enter his head, nor did it occur to him that he would soon be hungry and thirsty. He looked around for a while. The place was crammed with junk of all kinds. There were shelves full of old files and records. Benches and ink-stained desks were heaped up every which way. A dozen old maps were hanging on an iron frame. There were blackboards that had lost a good deal of their black and cast iron stoves. Broken down pieces of gymnasium equipment, including a horse with the stuffing coming out through the cracks in its side. A number of soiled mats. There were also quite a few stuffed animals, at least what the moths had left of them. A big owl, a golden eagle, a fox, and so on. Cracked retorts and other chemical equipment, galvanometer, a human skeleton hanging on a clothes rack, and a large number of cartons full of old books and papers. Bastian finally decided to make his home on the pile of old gym mats, where he stretched out on them. It was almost like lying on a sofa. He dragged them to the place under the skylight where the light was best. Not far away, he found a pile of gray army blankets. They were dusty and ragged, but that didn't matter now. He carried them over to his nest. He took off his wet coat and hung it on the clothes rack beside the skeleton. The skeleton jiggled and swayed, but Bastian had no fear of it, maybe because he was used to such things at home. He also removed his wet shoes. In his stocking feet, he squatted down on the mats and wrapped himself in the gray blankets like an Indian. Beside him lay his school satchel and the copper-colored book. It passed through his mind that the rest of them down in the classroom would be having history just them. Maybe they'd be writing a composition on some deadly, dull subject. Bastian looked at the book. I wonder, he said to himself, what's in a book while it's closed? Oh, I know, it's full of letters printed on paper, but all the same, something must be happening, because as soon as I open it, there's a whole story with people I don't know yet and all kinds of adventures and deeds and battles. And sometimes there are storms at sea, or it takes you to strange cities and countries. All those things are somehow shut up in a book. And of course, you have to read it to find out. But it's already there. That's the funny thing. I just wish I knew how it could be. Suddenly, an almost festive mood came over him. He settled himself, picked up the book, opened it to the first page, and began to read The Never-Ending Story. Chapter 1. Fantasia in Danger. All the beasts in howling forests were safe in their caves, nests, and burrows. It was midnight. The storm wind was whistling through the tops of the great ancient trees. The towering trunks creaked and groaned. Suddenly, a faint light came zigzagging through the woods, stopped here and there, trembling fitfully, flew up into the air, rested on a branch, and a moment later hurried on. It was a glittering sphere about the size of a child's ball. It moved in long leaps, touched the ground now and then bounded up again. But it wasn't a ball. It was a will-o'-the-wisp. It had lost its way. And that's something quite unusual even in Fantasia, because ordinarily, will-o'-the-wisps make others lose their way. Inside this ball of light, there was a small, exceedingly active figure which ran and jumped with all its might. It was neither male nor female, for such distinctions don't exist among will-o'-the-wisps. In its right hand, it carried a tiny white flag which glittered behind it. That meant it was either a messenger or a flag of truce bearer. You'd think it would have bumped into a tree, leaping like that in the darkness. But there was no danger of that, for will-o'-the-wisps are incredibly nimble and can change direction in the middle of a leap. That explains the zigzagging, but in a general sort of way, it moved in a definite direction, up to the moment when it came to a jutting crag and started back in a fright. Whimpering like a puppy, it sat down on the fork of a tree and pondered a while before venturing out and cautiously looking around the crag. Up ahead, it saw a clearing in the woods, and there in the light of a campfire sat three figures of different sizes and shapes. A giant, who looked as if the whole of him were made of gray stone, lay stretched out on his belly. He was almost 10 feet long. Propped up on one elbow, he was looking into the fire. In his weather-beaten stone face, which seemed strangely small in comparison with his powerful shoulders, his teeth stood out like a row of steel chisels. The will-o'-the-wisp recognized him as belonging to the family of rock chewers. These were creatures who lived in a mountain range inconceivably far from howling forest. But they not only lived in the mountain range, they also lived on it. For little by little, they were eating it up. Rocks were their only food. Luckily, a little went a long way. They could live for weeks and months on a single bite of this, for them, extremely nutritious fare. They weren't very many rock chewers, and besides, it was a large mountain range. But since these giants had been there a long time, they lived to a greater age than most of the inhabitants of Fantasia. Those mountains had come, over the years, to look very strange, like an enormous Swiss cheese, full of holes and groats. And that is why they were known as cheesy wheezies. But the rock chewers not only fed on stone, they made everything they needed out of it: furniture, hats, shoes, tools, even cuckoo clocks. So it was not surprising that the vehicle of this particular giant was now leaning against a tree behind him, was a sort of bicycle made entirely of this material, with two wheels that looked like enormous millstones. On the whole, it suggested a steamroller with pedals. The second figure, who was sitting to the right of the first, was a little night hob, no more than twice the size of the will-o'-the-wisp. He looked like a pitch black, furry caterpillar sitting up. He had little pink hands, with which he gestured violently as he spoke, and below his tousled black hair, two big round eyes glowed like moons in what was presumably his face. Since there were night hobs of all shapes and sizes in every part of Fantasia, it was hard to tell by the sight of him whether this one had come far or near, but one could guess that he was traveling, because the usual mount of the night hobs, a large bat, wrapped in its wings like a closed umbrella, was hanging head down from a nearby branch. It took the will-o'-the-wisp some time to discover the third person on the left side of the fire, for he was so small as to be scarcely discernible from that distance. He was one of the tinies, a delicately built little fellow in a bright colored suit and a top hat. Move. The will-o'-the-wisp knew next to nothing about tinies, but it had once heard that these people built whole cities in the branches of trees and that the houses were connected by stairways, rope ladders, and ramps. By the tinies lived in an entirely different part of the boundless Fantasian empire, even further away than the rock chewers, which made it all the more amazing that the mount which made it all the more amazing that the mount, which had evidently carried the tiny all this way, was, of all things, a snail. Its pink shell was surmounted by a gleaming silver saddle, and its bridle, as well as the reins fastened to its feelers, glittered like silver threads. The will-o'-the-wisp couldn't get over it that three such different creatures should be sitting there so peacefully. For harmony between different species was by no means the rule in Fantasia. Battles and wars were frequent, and certain of the species had been known to feud for hundreds of years. Moreover, not all the inhabitants of Fantasia were good and honorable. There were also thieving, wicked, and cruel ones. The will-o'-the-wisp itself belonged to a family that was hardly reputed for truthfulness or reliability. After observing the scene in the firelight for some time, the will-o'-the-wisp noticed that each of the three had something white, either a flag or a white scarf worn across the chest, which meant that they were messengers or flag of truth bearers. And that, of course, accounted for the peaceful atmosphere. Could they be traveling on the same business as the will-o'-the-wisp? What they were saying couldn't be heard from a distance because of the howling wind in the treetops. But since they respected one another as messengers, mightn't they recognize the will-o'-the-wisp in the same capacity and refrain from harming him? It had to ask someone the way, and there seemed like little likelihood of finding a better opportunity at this hour in the middle of the woods. So, plucking up courage, it ventured out of its hiding place and hovered trembling in midair, waving its white flag. The rock chewer, whose face was turned in that direction, was first to notice the will-o'-the-wisp. "Lots of traffic around here tonight," he crackled. "Here comes another one." "Who?" "It's a will-o'-the-wisp," whispered the night hob, and his moon eyes glowed. "Pleased to meet you." The tiny stood up, took a few steps toward the newcomer, and chirped, "If my eyes don't deceive me, you are here as a messenger." "Yes, indeed," said the will-o'-the-wisp. The tiny removed his red top hat, made a slight bow, and twittered, "Oh, do you join us? We too are messengers. Won't you be seated?" And with his hat, he motioned toward an empty place by the fire. Many thanks, said the Will-o'-the-Wisp, coming timidly closer. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Blub. Delighted, said the Tiny. Mine is Gluecuck. The Night Hob bowed without getting up. My name is Vush Vazul, and mine, the rock chewer crackled, is Piron Crackzark. All three looked at the Will-o'-the-Wisp, who was wriggling with embarrassment. Will-o'-the-Wisps find it most unpleasant to be looked full in the face. Won't you sit down, dear Blub? Said the Tiny. To tell the truth, said the Will-o'-the-Wisp, I'm in a terrible hurry. I only wanted to ask if by any chance you knew the way to the ivory tower. Who? Said the Night Hob. Could you be going to see the childlike empress? Exactly, said the Will-o'-the-Wisp. I have an important message for her. What does it say? The rock chewer crackled. But you see, said the Will-o'-the-Wisp, shifting its weight from foot to foot, it's a secret message. All three of us, ooh, have the same mission as you, replied Vush Vazul, the Night Hob. That makes us partners. Maybe we even have the same message, said Gluecuck, the Tiny. Sit down and tell us. Piorn Crackzark crackled. The Will-o'-the-Wisp sat down in the empty place. My home. It began after a moment's hesitation. It's a long way from here. I don't know if any of those present has heard of it. It's called Maldemore. Whoo! Cried the Night Hob delightedly. A lovely country. The Will-o'-the-Wisp smiled faintly. Yes, isn't it? Is that all you have to say, Blub? Piorn Crackzark crackled. What is the purpose of your trip? Something has happened in Moldamore, said the Will-o'-the-Wisp haltingly. Something impossible to understand. Actually, it's still happening. It's hard to describe. The way it began was, well, in the east of our country, there's a lake. That is, there was a lake. Lake Foaming Broth, we called it. Well, the way it began was like this. One day, Lake Foaming Broth wasn't there anymore. It was gone. See? You mean it dried up? Gluecuck inquired. No, said the Will-o'-the-Wisp. Then there'd be a dried up lake, but there isn't. Where the lake used to be, there's nothing. Absolutely nothing. Now do you see? A hole? The rock chewer grunted. No, not a hole, said the Will-o'-the-Wisp despairingly. A hole, after all, is something. This is nothing at all. The three other messengers exchanged glances. What? Who does this nothing look like? Asked the Night Hob. That's just what's so hard to describe, said the Will-o'-the-Wisp unhappily. It doesn't look like anything. It's like, oh, there's no word for it. Maybe, the Tiny suggested, when you look at the place, it's as if you were blind. The Will-o'-the-Wisp stared open-mouthed. Exactly, it cried. But where? I mean, how? I mean, have you had the same? Wait a minute, the rock chewer crackled. Was it only this one place? At first, yes, the Will-o'-the-Wisp explained. That is, the place got bigger, little by little. And then all of a sudden, Foggle, the father of the frogs, who lived in Lake Foaming Broth with his family, was gone too. Some of the inhabitants started running away, but little by little, the same thing happened to other parts of Moldamore. It usually started with just a little chunk, no bigger than a partridge egg. But then these chunks got bigger and bigger. If somebody put his foot into one of them by mistake, the foot or hand or whatever else he put would be gone. It didn't hurt. If somebody put his foot into one of them by mistake, the foot or hand or whatever else he put in would be gone too. It didn't hurt. It was just that a part of whoever it was would be missing. Some would even fall in on purpose if they got too close to the nothing. It has an irresistible attraction. The bigger the place, the stronger the pull. None of us could imagine what this terrible thing might be, what caused it, and what we could do about it. And seeing that it didn't go away by itself, but kept spreading, we finally decided to send a messenger to the childlike empress to ask her for advice and help. Well, I'm the messenger. The three others gazed silently into space. After a while, the night hop sighed. Whoo! It's the same where I come from. And I'm traveling on the exact same errand. Whoo! Whoo! The tiny turned to the will-o'-the-wisp. Each one of us, he chirped, comes from a different province of Fantasia. We've met here entirely by chance, but each one of us is going to the childlike empress with the same message. And the message, grated the rock chewer, is that all Fantasia is in danger. The will-o'-the-wisp cast a terrified look at each one in turn. If that's the case, it cried, jumping up, we haven't a moment to lose. We were just going to start, said the tiny. We only stopped to rest because it's so awfully dark here in Howling Forest. But now that you've joined us, Blub, you can light the way. Impossible, said the will-o'-the-wisp. Would you expect me to wait for someone who rides a snail? Sorry. But it's a racing snail, said the tiny, somewhat miffed. Otherwise, hoo, hoo. The night hop sighed. We won't tell you which way to go. Who are you people talking to? The rock chewer crackled. And sure enough, the will-o'-the-wisp hadn't even heard the other messenger's last words, for it was already flitting through the forest in long leaps. Oh well, said the tiny, pushing his top hat onto the back of his head. Maybe it wouldn't have been such a good idea to follow a will-o'-the-wisp. To tell the truth, said the night hop, I prefer to travel on my own, because I, for one, fly. With a quick hoo, hoo, he ordered his bat to make ready, and whish, away he flew. The rock chewer put out the campfire with the palm of his hand. I, too, prefer to go by myself, he crackled in the darkness. Then I don't need to worry about squashing some wee creature. Rattling and grinding, he rode his stone bicycle straight into the woods, now and then thudding into a tree giant. Slowly the clatter receded in the distance. Gluckuk, the tiny, was last to step out. He seized the silvery reins and said, All right, we'll see who gets there first. Geop, old timer, Geop. Or giddy up, old timer, giddy up. And he clicked his tongue. And then there was nothing to be heard but the storm wind howling in the treetops. The clock in the belfry struck 9. Reluctantly, Bastion's thought turned back to reality. He was glad the NeverEnding Story had nothing to do with that. He didn't like books in which dull, cranky writers describe humdrum events in the very humdrum lives of humdrum people. Reality gave him enough of that kind of thing. Why should he read about it? Besides, he couldn't stand it when a writer tried to convince him of something. And these humdrum books, it seemed to him, were always trying to do just that. Bastion liked books that were exciting or funny, or that made him dream. Books where made up characters and marvelous adventures, books that made him imagine all sorts of things. Because one thing he was good at, possibly the one thing he was imagining, because one thing he was good at, possibly the only thing, was imagining things so clearly that he almost saw and heard them. When he told himself stories, he sometimes forgot everything around him and awoke, as though from a dream, only when the story was finished. And this book was just like his own stories. In reading it, he had heard not only the creaking of the big trees and the howling of the wind in the treetops, but also the different voices of the four comical messengers. And he almost seemed to catch the smell of moss and forest earth. Down in the classroom, they were starting in on nature study. That consisted almost entirely in counting pistils and stamens. Bastian was glad to be up here in his hiding place where he could read. This, he thought, was just the right book for him. A week later, Vus Vazul, the little night hob, arrived at his destination. He was the first, or rather, he thought he was first, because he was riding through the air. Just as the setting sun turned the clouds to liquid gold, he noticed that his bat was circling over the labyrinth. That was the name of an enormous garden, extending from horizon to horizon and filled with the most bewitching scents and dreamlike colors. Broad avenues and narrow paths twined their way among corpses, lawns, and beds of the rarest, strangest flowers in a design so artful and intricate that the whole plain resembled an enormous maze. Of course, it had been designed only for pleasure and amusement, with no intention of endangering anyone, much less of warding off an enemy. It would have been useless for such purposes, and the childlike empress required no such protection, because in all the unbounded reaches of Fantasia, there was no one who would have thought of attacking her. For that there was a reason, as we shall soon see. While gliding soundlessly over the flowery maze, the night hob sighted all sorts of animals. In a small clearing between lilacs and laburnum, a group of young unicorns was playing in the sun, and once glancing under a giant bluebell, he even thought he saw the famous phoenix in its nest. But he wasn't quite certain, and such was his haste that he didn't want to turn back to make sure. For at the center of the labyrinth, there now appeared, shimmering in fairy whiteness, while gliding soundlessly over the flowery maze, the night hob sighted all sorts of animals. In a small clearing between lilacs and the laburnum, a group of young unicorns was playing in the evening sun. And once, glancing under a giant bluebell, he even thought he saw the famous phoenix in its nest. But he wasn't quite certain, and such was his haste, and that he didn't want to turn back to make sure. For at the center of the labyrinth there now appeared, shimmering in fairy whiteness, the ivory tower, the heart of Fantasia, and the residence of the childlike empress. The word tower might give someone who has never seen it the wrong idea. It had nothing of the church or castle about it. The ivory tower was as big as a whole city. From a distance, it looked like a pointed mountain peak, twisted like a snail's shell. Its highest point was deep in the clouds. Only on coming closer could you notice that this great sugar loaf consisted of innumerable towers, turrets, domes, roofs, oriels, terraces, arches, stairways, balustrades, all marvelously fitted together. The whole was made of the whitest Fantasian ivory, so delicately carved in every detail that it might have been taken for the lattice work of the finest lace. These buildings housed the childlike empress court, her chamberlains and maid servants, wise women and astrologers, magicians and gestures, messengers, cooks and acrobats, her tightrope walkers and storytellers, heralds, gardeners, watchmen, tailors, shoemakers, and alchemists. And at the very summit of the great tower lived the childlike empress in a pavilion shaped like a magnolia blossom. On certain nights, when the full moon shone most glorious in the starry sky, the ivory petals opened wide, and the childlike empress would be sitting in the middle of the glorious flower. Riding on his bat, the little night hob landed on one of the lower terraces where the stables were located. Someone must have announced his arrival, for 5 imperial grooms were there waiting for him. They helped him out of his saddle, bowed to him, and held out the ceremonial welcome cup. As etiquette demanded, Vush Vazul took only a sip and then returned the cup. Each of the grooms took a sip. Then they bowed again and led the bat to the stables. All this was done in silence. On reaching its appointed place, the bat touched neither food nor drink, but immediately rolled up, hung itself head down on a hook, and fell into a deep sleep. The little night hob had demanded a bit too much of his mount. The grooms left it alone and crept away from the stable on tiptoes. In this stable, there were many other mounts: 2 elephants, one pink and one blue, a gigantic griffin with the forequarters of an eagle and the hindquarters of a lion, a winged horse whose name was once known even outside of Fantasia, but is now forgotten, several flying dogs, a few other bats, and several dragonflies and butterflies for especially small riders. In other stables, there were still other mounts, which didn't fly but ran, crawled, hopped, or swam, and each had a groom of its own to feed and take care of it. Ordinarily, one would have expected to hear quite a cacophony of different voices, roaring, screeching, piping, chirping, croaking, and chattering. But that day there was utter silence. The little night hob was still standing where the grooms had left him. Suddenly, without knowing why, he felt dejected and discouraged. He too was exhausted after the long trip, and not even the knowledge that he had arrived first could cheer him up. Suddenly he heard a chirping voice. Hello? Hello? If it isn't my good friend, Vush Vazul. So glad you finally made it. The night hob looked around, and his moon eyes flared with excitement, for on a balustrade, leaning negligently against a flower pot, stood Glukuk, the tiny, tipping his red top hat. Hoo, hoo, went the bewildered night hob, and again, hoo, hoo. He just couldn't think of anything better to say. The other two haven't arrived yet. I've been here since yesterday morning. Hoo, hoo. How did you do it? Simple, said the tiny, with a rather condescending smile. Didn't I tell you I had a racing snail? The night hob scratched his tangled black head fur with his little pink hand. I must go to the childlike empress at once, he said mournfully. The tiny gave him a pensive look. He said. I put in for an appointment yesterday. Put in for an appointment? Asked the night hob. Can't we just go in and see her? I'm not afraid, chirped the tiny. We'll have a long wait. You can't imagine how many messengers have turned up. Hoo, hoo, the night hob sighed. How come? You better take a look for yourself, the tiny twittered. Come with me, my dear Vush Vazul. Come with me. The two of them started out. The high street, which wound around the ivory tower in a narrowing spiral, was clogged with a dense crowd of the strangest creatures, enormous, beturbaned jinns, tiny kobolds, three-headed trolls, bearded dwarfs, glittering fairies, goat-legged fauns, nixies with wavy golden hair, sparkling snow sprites, and countless others were milling about, standing in groups or sitting silently on the ground, discussing the situation or gazing glumly into the distance. Vush Vazul stopped still when he saw them. "Who? Who?" he said. "What's going on? What are they all doing here?" "They're all messengers," Glukuk explained. "Messengers from all over Fantasia, all with the same message as ours. I've spoken with several of them. The same menace seems to have broken out everywhere." The night hob gave vent to a long wheezing sigh. "Do they know?" he asked. "What is it and where it comes from?" "I'm afraid not. Nobody knows." "What about the childlike empress?" "The childlike empress," said the tiny, in an undertone, "is ill, very ill. Maybe that's the cause of this mysterious calamity that's threatening all Fantasia. But so far, none of the many doctors who've been conferring in the Magnolia Pavilion has discovered the nature of her illness or found a cure for it. That," said the night hob breathlessly, "is terrible." "So it is," said the tiny. In view of the circumstances, Vush Vazul decided not to put in for an appointment. 2 days later, Blub, the will-o'-the-wisp, arrived. Of course, he had hopped in the wrong direction and made an enormous detour. And finally, 3 days after that, Bjorn Krakzark, the Rockchur, appeared. He came plodding along on foot, for in a sudden frenzy of hunger he had eaten his stone bicycle. During the long-waited period, the four so unalike messengers became good friends. From then on, they stayed together. But that's another story and shall be told another time. And that concludes episode 74. In episode 75, we're going to be going into chapter 2 of Atreyu's mission. This is a very special story from a very special book. I highly recommend you get a chance to dive into the NeverEnding Story. You do just that. This is one of my favorite stories from my childhood, and I'm reading it to my children right now, so I'm very thankful about that. I got a few things that I got to do. You all do your thing. Keep winning, be blessed, and expose your